Dark chocolate. Let's start with the one everyone thinks they understand, but usually doesn't. Dark chocolate. Dark chocolate is made from cocoa solids, cocoa butter, and sugar with no milk added. That's the single biggest thing separating it from milk chocolate. The percentage you see on the wrapper, like 70% dark, tells you how much of the bar comes from the cocoa bean itself, the solids and the butter combined, versus sugar. A higher percentage means more intense, bitter, and complex flavor and less sweetness. A 90% bar is going to hit your tongue very differently than a 55% bar, which is almost gateway dark for people used to milk chocolate. Dark chocolate's flavor depends heavily on where the cocoa beans are grown, how they're fermented, and how they're roasted. Beans from Madagascar might give you red fruit, almost citrusy notes. Beans from Ecuador might lean floral. This is why serious chocolate makers talk about cocoa the way wine people talk about grapes. Terroir matters. Dark chocolate also has real nutritional talking points. It contains flavonols, which have been linked to heart health benefits, and it generally has less sugar than milk chocolate. That's part of why it gets marketed as the healthier chocolate, though that claim depends a lot on the percentage and the added sugar content. Milk chocolate. Milk chocolate is the one most people grew up on. It's made the same basic way as dark chocolate. Cocoa solids, cocoa butter, sugar, but with milk powder or condensed milk added into the mix. That milk component softens the flavor, rounds out the bitterness of the cocoa, and gives it that creamy, comforting texture people associate with classic candy bars. Milk chocolate typically contains a much lower percentage of actual cocoa, often somewhere between 10% and 50%, with the rest made up of milk and sugar. This is why milk chocolate tastes sweeter and less complex than dark chocolate. The cocoa flavor is diluted by design. The origin of milk chocolate, as we know it, traces back to Switzerland in the late 1800s, when Daniel Peter figured out how to combine chocolate with condensed milk, solving the problem of milk's water content clashing with cocoa butter. That innovation basically created the chocolate industry as most people experience it today. Hershey's, Cadbury, Milka, all of it sits on that foundation. White chocolate. Here's where things get controversial. White chocolate technically isn't chocolate at all, depending on who you ask, because it contains no cocoa solids, only cocoa butter, sugar, and milk solids. Cocoa solids are what give chocolate its brown color and much of its chocolate flavor. So without them, white chocolate is really just a sweetened, milky confection made from the fat portion of the cocoa bean. That said, cocoa butter itself does carry a subtle chocolate aroma, which is why white chocolate isn't just candy. It has a genuine link back to the cacao plant. Quality matters a lot here. Cheap white chocolate often swaps out real cocoa butter for vegetable fats, which is technically called white confectionery coating, rather than true white chocolate. Real white chocolate, made with actual cocoa butter, has a smoother melt and a more delicate, slightly nutty flavor compared to the waxy, overly sweet stuff you find in cheaper products. Ruby chocolate. Ruby chocolate is the new kid on the block, introduced by the Belgian-Swiss company Barry Callebaut in 2017. It's the first new chocolate type introduced in about 80 years, and what makes it wild is that its pink-red color and berry-like tang come entirely from the ruby cocoa bean itself. No berries, no food coloring, no flavoring added. The science behind it involves specific processing techniques that unlock naturally occurring compounds in a certain type of cocoa bean, giving it that distinct fruity sourness and rosy hue. It's a genuinely different sensory experience from dark milk or white chocolate, less like classic chocolate and more like a fruity dessert with cocoa undertones. Because of its novelty and the marketing power behind its launch, ruby chocolate quickly became a favorite for Instagram-worthy desserts, though some chocolate purists still debate how naturally it should be categorized as a genuine fourth type of chocolate versus a specially processed variant. Couverture. Chocolate. Couverture is less about a flavor category and more about a professional grade classification. It's the chocolate that pastry chefs and chocolatiers use, and the defining trait is a higher percentage of cocoa butter than standard eating chocolate, usually at least 31%. That extra cocoa butter makes couverture thinner and more fluid when melted, which is essential for coating, dipping, and creating that glossy, snappy shell you see on truffles and bonbons. Couverture can technically be dark, milk, or white. The couverture label just refers to the cocoa butter content and quality standard, not a flavor profile on its own. Working with couverture properly requires tempering, a process of heating and cooling the chocolate through specific temperature stages to stabilize the cocoa butter crystals. Skip tempering, and you get chocolate that's dull, streaky, and soft. At room temperature, instead of that clean snap, you get biting into a well-made chocolate bar. Compound chocolate. Compound chocolate is the budget cousin of real chocolate. Instead of cocoa butter, it uses cheaper vegetable fats like palm kernel oil or soybean oil to bind the cocoa solids and sugar together. This substitution makes it more heat-stable and much easier to work with, since it doesn't require tempering the way real chocolate does. You can just melt it and pour it, and it'll set up fine at room temperature. That convenience comes at the cost of flavor and texture. Compound chocolate tends to taste flatter and can have a slightly waxy mouthfeel compared to real chocolate, since cocoa butter is responsible for that clean, quick melt on the tongue. It's commonly used in mass-produced candy coatings, chocolate fountains, cake pops, and cheap Easter bunnies. Basically, anywhere cost and convenience matter more than a premium chocolate experience. If you've ever bitten into a chocolate coating that felt a little off, slightly greasy, or oddly firm, there's a good chance it was compound chocolate rather than the real thing. Semi-sweet and bittersweet chocolate. Semi-sweet and bittersweet chocolate sit in the space between unsweetened chocolate and standard dark chocolate. And honestly, the line between the two is blurry and inconsistent depending on the brand. Generally, bittersweet chocolate has less sugar and a higher cocoa percentage than semi-sweet, making it taste more intense and less sweet, while semi-sweet leans a bit sweeter and softer. Both are staples in baking, especially for chocolate chips, ganache, and mousse, because they strike a balance, enough sugar to be pleasant on their own, but enough cocoa intensity to stand up against other rich ingredients like butter and cream. In the US, the FDA actually has legal definitions requiring both types to contain at least 35% cocoa solids. But beyond that minimum, manufacturers have a lot of freedom, which is why one brand's semi-sweet can taste noticeably different from another's. Gianduja is a chocolate hazelnut hybrid that originated in Turin, Italy, and its backstory is genuinely interesting. During the Napoleonic era, a cocoa shortage in Europe led Italian chocolatiers to stretch their limited cocoa supply by blending it with finely ground roasted hazelnuts. What started as a practical workaround became a beloved specialty in its own right. Traditional gianduja is roughly a mix of chocolate and hazelnut paste, giving it a smooth, almost spreadable texture and a nutty sweetness that's distinct from straight chocolate. It's the direct ancestor of products like Nutella, though gianduja itself is typically sold in solid bar or praline form rather than as a spread. The texture is noticeably softer and creamier than standard chocolate because of the high fat content from the hazelnuts, and it melts almost instantly in the mouth. Raw chocolate. Raw chocolate refers to chocolate made from cacao beans that haven't been roasted at high temperatures or processed beyond a certain low temperature threshold, generally kept under around 118 degrees Fahrenheit, 48 degrees Celsius. The idea behind raw chocolate is preserving more of the natural nutrients and antioxidants in the cacao bean that can be diminished by traditional roasting. This category overlaps heavily with the health food and wellness world. Raw chocolate is often marketed alongside claims about higher antioxidant content and mineral retention, though the actual health benefits compared to regular dark chocolate are debated and not always strongly backed by conclusive research. Flavor-wise, raw chocolate tends to taste more earthy, slightly more acidic, and less roasted or caramelized than conventional chocolate, since roasting is what develops a lot of the deep, toasty notes people associate with classic chocolate flavor. Single origin chocolate. Single origin chocolate isn't really its own separate category of chocolate chemically. It can be dark, milk, or otherwise. But it's become such a distinct concept in the craft chocolate world that it deserves its own explanation. Single origin means all the cacao used in the bar comes from one specific location, sometimes even one specific farm or region, rather than being blended from beans sourced across multiple countries. The appeal is similar to single-origin coffee. It lets the specific flavor characteristics of that region's cacao shine through without being smoothed over by blending. A single-origin bar from Peru might taste completely different from one sourced in Ghana or Vietnam. reflecting differences in soil, climate, and traditional fermentation methods. This category has driven a huge portion of the craft chocolate or bean-to-bar movement over the past couple decades, with small makers competing to showcase the most distinctive, traceable flavor profiles rather than chasing consistency the way big commercial brands do. Modeling chocolate. Modeling chocolate is a specialty product built for one purpose: sculpting. It's made by combining melted chocolate, usually compound chocolate for stability, with a sugar syrup like corn syrup or glucose syrup. This combination transforms the chocolate from something that hardens and cracks into a pliable, dough-like substance that can be rolled, shaped, and molded almost like clay. Cake decorators and chocolatiers use modeling chocolate to create flowers, figures, ribbons, and other decorative elements that would be nearly impossible with regular tempered chocolate, since regular chocolate is too brittle and temperature sensitive to hold intricate hand-shaped forms. It still tastes like chocolate, just with a much softer, almost fondant-like texture, and it's typically not eaten on its own the way a candy bar would be. It's a decorative and structural tool, as much as it is a flavor. Cocoa powder based. Chocolate cocoa powder itself isn't a chocolate in the bar sense, but it deserves a spot here because so many chocolate-flavored products are built on it rather than actual chocolate. Cocoa powder is made by pressing most of the cocoa butter out of ground cacao beans, leaving behind a dry, concentrated cocoa solid that gets pulverized into powder. There are two main types: natural cocoa powder, which is acidic and has a sharper, more intense flavor, and Dutch processed cocoa powder, which has been treated with an alkalizing agent to neutralize that acidity and produce a smoother, darker, milder flavor. This distinction actually matters a lot in baking, since natural cocoa reacts with baking soda while Dutch processed cocoa needs baking powder instead, and mixing them up can throw off how a cake or cookie rises. Hot chocolate mixes, many chocolate-flavored cereals, and countless baked goods lean on cocoa powder rather than solid chocolate because it's cheaper, shelf-stable, and easier to blend into dry or liquid mixtures. Dark chocolate, revisited, the full spectrum to bring this full circle. Every type of chocolate on this list ultimately traces back to the same cacao bean, and the differences come down to processing choices. How much cocoa butter stays in, how much sugar and milk get added, how finely it's ground, and how it's tempered or shaped. Dark chocolate, with its minimal additions and high cocoa content, remains the closest thing to the purest expression of that bean, which is why it's such a useful reference point for understanding everything else on this list. Once you understand dark chocolate as the baseline, every other type, milk, white, ruby, compound, gianduja, raw, makes a lot more sense as a variation built from that same starting point.